When it comes to deciding whether to provide ultraviolet light for a captive reptile or amphibian, there are three general schools of thought, being that either none of them require it at all, or that particular species do need it while others don't, and then there are also people who will argue that every species does require some exposure to some degree. Now, most people genuinely do not actually understand enough about it to pass sensible judgment on this topic, and so what I'm going to be doing in today's video is discussing what UVB light actually is, what this means for our reptiles, and how you can use this with your own animals. So, I'm JTB Reptiles teaching you how to follow nature's example, and let's get straight into the video. So first up, what is ultraviolet? UV is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that forms the shortest wavelength, highest energy and highest frequency waves out of all of the optical radiation, which is something that I did discuss in episode 1 of this series. Now, just like infrared, UV can be subdivided into three sections, being UVA with a wavelength spanning from 320 to 400 nanometers, UVB with a wavelength of 280 to 320 nanometers, and UVC with a wavelength of 180 to 200 nanometers. Now, do take those values with a little pinch of salt, because depending on who you ask, you're going to get different values for that, but for our purposes, those values will do. Now, a very important thing to know is that the atmosphere does actually filter out all wavelengths below 290 nanometers. And what this means is that terrestrially and naturally on Earth, no UVC is present, and UVB is limited to the wavelengths of 290 nanometers and up. UVA, of course, is all present. Now, the filtering of UV from light by the atmosphere is actually a very important effect. Because UV is absorbed so readily by the atmosphere, the angle of the sun relative to a fixed point on the surface of the Earth can have a really big influence on the intensity of ultraviolet light that reaches that fixed point. When the sun is low in the sky, the UV must travel a quite long distance through the atmosphere to reach the fixed point, so more of it gets filtered out than when the sun is directly overhead and the distance travelled by the atmosphere is less. The net effect of this being that the intensity of UV peaks during the middle of the day when the sun is overhead and is reduced at dawn and dusk when the sun is lower in the sky. Now, continuing through this video, we are going to be talking about UV intensity a lot, and if we're going to be doing that, then it is important that we can quantify that in some way. There are actually a couple of ways of doing this, but the one that is most useful for us in this application is the UV index. Now, the UV index is basically a scale ranging from 0, which is what you would experience at night, to, in practice, the mid-teens. As I'm talking now, I'll pop up a few weather forecasts on the screen alongside the locations, just so that you can get sort of a general gist of what each index is sort of going to be like in real life. Now, as I'm doing this, remember that UV indices do change throughout the day, so although a reptile might live in a country where the maximum UV index can be very high indeed, that doesn't necessitate that it is actually going to experience that. So now that you've got a general gist of what ultraviolet light actually is, we're going to go on to talk about how UV actually interacts with animals out in the wild. Now, the real biggie with this one that most people are aware of is the synthesis of vitamin D3, otherwise called the sunshine vitamin. Now, to really know what this means, what I'm going to do now is talk about how vitamin D3 is actually formed. So what happens here is that in the skin of the animal, which in this case could be a reptile or an amphibian, there is a substance there derived from cholesterol which is known as provitamin D. When provitamin D is struck with ultraviolet B radiation, it converts it into another substance called previtamin D. Sufficient warmth will cause previtamin D to turn into our good old friend vitamin D3 itself, which moves on from the skin into the blood of the animal. D3 in the blood is taken round on a whistle-stop tour through the kidneys and the liver to get converted into another substance which works basically like a steroid to interact with the cells all around the body to ensure that calcium and phosphorus levels are balanced out properly. The most obvious interaction of calcium and phosphorus around the rest of the body is that it is involved in the formation of bone, given that bone is primarily formed out of calcium phosphate. But calcium and phosphorus do also have other roles around the body, such as being involved in neurological health, so the interactions of D3 with an animal don't just stop at bone development. So this is the way that vitamin D is formed in nature with UVB exposure, but there is actually another way of getting vitamin D3, and that is via the mouth. In doing this, effectively what you do is skip over the pro and pre-vitamin D steps in the skin, and this does have immediate implications in that it becomes quite difficult via oral supplementation to achieve the right balance of vitamin D. Now, very sadly, reptile keepers the world over are more than aware of the devastating effects of a condition called metabolic bone disease, which is well recognised as being brought on by an underprovision of vitamin D3. But less well known is a condition called hypervitaminosis D, which is brought on by the overprovision of D3, having symptoms such as kidney failure and also the calcification of soft tissues such as blood vessels, which does also have the unfortunate consequence of killing your reptile in due course. We simply do not know the exact vitamin D3 requirements of any given individual animal at any given time, and therefore it is not practically possible to get the exact correct balance of vitamin D3 through dietary supplementation alone, and of course that is going to make it very likely that we will start to see some issues, perhaps with underprovision or overprovision, even if these are only small. However, this is not the case when D3 is provided through ultraviolet radiation exposure. As well as turning pro-vitamin D into pre-vitamin D, UVB can convert pre-vitamin D into two storage forms of itself, and it can also break down vitamin D3 into some inert products. Now what this means is that if D3 is being formed in the skin faster than it's being used elsewhere in the body, then it will automatically be destroyed by these mechanisms. Moreover, our animals do seem to have some capacity to recognise that UVB exposure can aid them to produce D3, and so they can choose to move in and out of the radiation, provided that you also offer them with some areas of shade. You can therefore take it that where dietary D3 supplementation is basically a guesswork process and you're always going to be on a knife edge of getting it wrong, if you provide UVB exposure and let the animal get on with doing the natural process, you take away that guesswork and you just aren't going to have those issues. Now, a lesser known but very important fact is that most reptiles do have some capacity to see into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, typically seeing into UVA and not UVB. So really the way to think about this, I think, is that where some colourblind people can't see a particular colour, but non-colourblind people can, for a reptile, having the ability to see UV is just like that difference between how people see. So it's not like something completely magic, it is just seeing into another part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now with this in mind, quite a number of reptilian species have actually evolved UV reflective patterns on their skin that they use in communicating with each other. For example, as is seen in the European lacertid lizards. Now, UV exposure isn't all good, energy is energy, no matter what form it comes in, and so coming from UV, if there is too much energy from that, then it can be damaging, and that is why we get sunburn and so on. So different species have adapted to interact with ultraviolet in different ways. Now, of course, in the wild, if they want D3, they are basically going to have UV exposure in some form, and so you do see in different species a very clear balance between their behaviour and their physical adaptations that allow them to reap the benefits of UV without succumbing to the damage caused by it. A very clear example of this is in many species of lizards having skins that are able to block UV to a degree that suits their behaviour. So those lizards that live in environments with a really high UV index and are active in the middle of the day or near to the middle of the day when that UV index is attained, they tend to have skins that are able to block more UV, so like chuckwallers and bearded dragons do. Conversely, species that are nocturnal or crepuscular, such as leopard geckos and crested geckos, tend to have thinner skins that are less able to block UV, so the net effect really is that they come out when there is less UV and they have thinner skins so that they can then benefit from it. So the point you can gather is that these animals have evolved in many ways to interact with ultraviolet light. Now, when we translate that to the captive situation, should we or shouldn't we provide UV exposure? Well, as far as I'm concerned, if you keep a chameleon, you're going to give it the option to climb things, because in the wild it will climb things, right? And if you keep a dog, then you're going to go and walk it, because the wild counterpart, the wolf, likes to walk around all the time. So if you keep reptiles or amphibians that have evolved in many different ways to interact with UV in the wild, then surely it is our duty as keepers of these animals to provide them with that. But with that segment out the way, you're probably wondering how you can actually provide UV to your animals, and that is what we're going to dedicate the rest of the video to: practical applications of ultraviolet light. Now, perhaps the most important thing to take away here, because if you get it wrong it's going to be the most disastrous thing, is that UV can be overdone. Like I said, any energy, if overdone, is damaging, and so if you overstep the boundary and provide an animal with a UV intensity that is greater than it is evolved to cope with, then you are only going to see problems. Now, what I mean by this is that you have to look at the species of animal that you keep. So for example, if you look at a leopard gecko, it comes from a place in the world where a very, very high UV index is experienced in the wild. But this UV index is only seen at the middle of the day, but leopard geckos only come out at dawn and dusk, and therefore to provide them with that maximum UV index is only going to damage them for reasons discussed earlier. What we must therefore do is factor in both the behaviour and the environment of the animal, and only ever provision it with a UV index that is the maximum that it would ever choose to expose itself to in the wild, and alongside this we must also provide lots of shaded areas so that it can regulate its own exposure. Another very, very important thing to take note of is that, as I said at the start of the video, the only wavelengths of UV that make it through the atmosphere are between 290 and 400 nanometers, so you know, above 290 nanometers, let's get that right. So really what we want to make sure that we're doing is never providing wavelengths that are lower than that, because they are only going to be dangerous given that the animals have not evolved in the slightest to cope with them. In choosing a bulb for your reptile, you do have to take into consideration all of those things, and so it can be quite difficult to do, but nowadays luckily there are different tools to help you with that. One of the best ones is like Arcadia's interactive lighting guide, which I'll throw a link to down in the description, and then there are also things called Ferguson zones and different UV lamp charts. But there are means to do that, so if it's something you're a bit afraid of, then just contact me and I'll give you the appropriate link to help you out. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all bulb. So for my bearded dragon down there, I've got a 14% output UVB bulb, but if I were to be putting that over the mesh of an enclosure, which, you know, mesh filters out some of the light, or if the enclosure were to be taller, then I would need a more intense bulb, or I would have to alter something else in the way that I'm doing it. But precisely what I would alter is very individualised, and that is why you need to look at lighting guides or like use a UVB meter rather than just taking it the particular bulb is a one size fits all. More on positioning UV, well, plenty of people do actually ask, can UV pass through glass? So if you put your enclosure by a window, are they going to be getting enough? And the simple answer to that in most cases is no. There are some materials like particular plastics and low iron glass that do transmit some UV, but your bog standard silicate glass or whatever is going to filter it out, so that is not going to work. And then when you position the bulb inside your enclosure or on top of a mesh, you want to make sure that it is directly above the animal, because they've only evolved to cope with it coming from above, not from the side, and putting it from the side can lead to eye damage, for example, because they just aren't evolved to cope with that. As for which type of bulb is the best, well, that is individualised too. I'm going to talk about just fluorescence and compact lights in this video, because there are other types such as mercury vapour bulbs and metal halides, but they are a particularly special case that I want to dedicate another video to. And then there are also some other rumoured types such as LEDs, but these aren't proven out yet, so just avoid them. But there are the two main types that are valid are compact and fluorescent bulbs, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Each type of bulb does have its own limitations. Compact UVB bulbs, being that they are compact, only project UV over a very narrow area, and so for anything but the smallest of reptiles, they aren't really that useful. So for a bearded dragon, for example, a compact bulb isn't going to be doing much for you, but if you're keeping dart frogs or day geckos, the appropriate percentage output compact bulb could be very useful for you. In basically all cases though, you do want to opt for a compact bulb that is of the 3U style rather than the pigtail style, because the pigtail ones send light in on themselves too much and most of that does get wasted. But in whatever circumstance, you want to have them positioned horizontally rather than vertically, so that the amount of UV that is going to be reaching your reptile is greater. Fluorescent bulbs come in two sizes these days, being T5, which are thinner, and T8, which are thicker. Now, these bulbs are similar to compact in that they send off light in all sorts of directions around the bulb, but they are, as you can tell, very linear and long, so they can cast UV over a much wider area. As a result, fluorescent bulbs are much better at providing light over a much broader area, which of course is much more usable for larger species of reptile and also for providing an overall light level across the entire enclosure. And one very important thing to mention about fluorescent lights is that they do require a separate ballast, or well, sometimes it's integrated into the units that you get them with, but basically if you are getting one of those ones with a separate ballast, I'll throw up some pictures of what the ballasts look like, you want to make sure that you are using an electronic rather than a magnetic ballast. I mean, most of the ones available nowadays are all electronic anyway, but when you are selecting one of these, you want to use it so that it is rated for the same wattage bulb that you want. So for example, if you want to use an 18 watt fluorescent with one, then you pick an 18 watt rated ballast and not ballast, and not anything higher, because that is not going to run the bulb properly. Now in each case, what you'll see on the box of the bulb is that it is given a particular rating. So the common ratings are 2.0, 5.0 and 10.0, or sometimes given as 2%, 5 to 7%, 10 to 12%, and then of course Arcadia does have their own 14% UVB bulb. What these values mean is how much of the light that is given out is actually ultraviolet. So for example, a 5.0 or 5% bulb will be giving out 5% of its energy as ultraviolet B. Alongside this, most bulbs nowadays do give out some UVA as well. How much of this they give out generally isn't stated as much, but for some bulbs it is like given on the front. I know the Arcadia ones do it, and generally you see it being about 30%-ish. Again, no matter the bulb type, the higher the output in terms of the percentage of UVB that is given is going to mean the higher the UV index that will be experienced at a fixed distance away from the bulb. So what I mean is if you've got a 5.0 bulb and a 10.0 bulb, or I'm doing a gesture that suggests linear fluorescent, but you get the point. If you were to measure the UV index 45 centimeters away from that bulb, it's going to be higher for the 10.0 rather than the 5.0, just because that's how it works. Of course then, this is one of those things that you're going to have to look into when you're deciding what bulb you require for your animal. A limitation of both of these common bulb types is that, as I've alluded to, they send light off in all directions. Now obviously, if you've got the bulb positioned above the reptile, which you should do to prevent eye issues, then most of that light is going to be up and away and not actually going towards your reptile, which is of course useless, and therefore getting a proper reflector is essential. The reflectors that you want to opt for are the ones with the metallic surfaces, because ones with sort of painted white surfaces are not actually going to reflect the UV, but instead are going to absorb it, so those of course aren't useful. So once you've got that, you can also then subdivide them into two categories of dimpled and smooth reflectors. Now Now each of these again does have slightly different properties, but a general property to go with is that the dimpled ones tend to diffuse the light a bit more and are more suitable for using on mesh top enclosures than smooth ones. But there's no set rule there, and again it is a very individual thing that you are going to have to talk to some people in the know to make sure that you get it right. So to summarise what I've said there, because I know it is quite a lot, is basically there are two types of UV bulb on the market. There are compact lamps and there are fluorescent lamps. Fluorescent lamps are long and linear and cast light over a wide area, whereas compact bulbs provide a much tighter beam, and consequently fluorescent tubes are more usable for larger species in larger enclosures than compact bulbs, which are only really usable for the smallest of species or targeted UV hotspots. In either circumstance, which bulb you are going to need depends on how far away it is from the reptile and whether or not it is projected through a mesh or some substance that will otherwise absorb some of the UV. The bulb has to be positioned above the reptile so as not to cause eye issues or anything of that nature, and you always want to use a reflector with a metallic surface so that you are actually directing the light, including UV, towards the reptile rather than just have it going off and being wasted. So yeah, that's a lot to get to grips with there if you're not familiar with any of it, but once you get into it, it's not too hard, and if you do speak to the right people, then it can become quite simple quite soon. And on that note, and as we draw to the end of this video, I do want to give some massive shout outs to Roman Murin, Francis Baines and Serena Wunderlich for helping me produce this video, because without them it just wouldn't have been possible, because you know, there's a lot of technical info that I've gone into here to really try and give a good argument, so I hope that it was worth it. But you can, if you want, find out more about those people and what they do, and therefore learn more about providing UV to your reptiles, as well as heat and other forms of lighting. Then I'll chuck down some descriptions, some links in the description box, and you can go and follow those if you'd like. And from those you can also learn more about how you can provide UV effectively, because on the Facebook groups that I'll link you to, there are all sorts of files and things, so there's plenty that you can learn. Whew. But anyway, I hope that this video has taught you a bit about ultraviolet at least, or if it didn't, you somehow find it interesting or enjoyable or whatever. But anyway, I hope that I have really put across that UV exposure is not something trivial, and that, you know, dietary vitamin D3 supplementation just isn't really a valid way to provide it, and ultraviolet exposure is just superior. So hopefully now, if you didn't think that before, I've changed your opinion. But I think I'm pretty much all out on this for now. So like I say, if you did enjoy the video, or if you did learn something from it, then please subscribe to the channel, because I've been JTB Reptiles, teaching you how to follow nature's example, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.